Hello, everyone. My name is Dilip NATHWANI. It's my great pleasure to be involved in this online seminar on the Symposium on Advanced Infection Control in 2020, with a particular focus on antimicrobial stewardship. The remit of my talk is to talk about the development and implementation of a national antimicrobial stewardship program. I will use my experience from setting up a program in Scotland as part of the United Kingdom, as well as I'll give you some global examples of what works and what perhaps does not work to provide a resilient, robust, and sustainable antimicrobial stewardship program. The objectives of the presentation of around 45 minutes is to talk about the types of AMS interventions, the impact of these antimicrobial stewardship programs, before I progress onto national approaches, developing an action plan for the UK and Scotland within the UK. And then I go on to talking about a much more implementation science focused approach that we used to develop and implement our national program. I talk about the kinds of impact on different outcomes and perhaps share some joint learning which will be applicable to a global and a Hong Kong setting. The definition of antimicrobial stewardship is well known to all of you, but the reason I put this slide up is to make 3 points. To me, it's a threefold definition. It's defined as an organizational or healthcare system-wide approach to promote and monitor the judicious use of antimicrobials. And I think this systems approach is very important. But the second is at a much more patient level, defined as the optimal selection of the dose, the duration, the type, so as to ensure the most optimal outcome and the reduced harm that is associated with overuse of antimicrobials. But increasingly, I think we all recognize the important role of diagnostic uncertainty. And I think, therefore, misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis is often the driver for overuse. And I think the emerging concept of diagnostic stewardship and its value on the outcomes that have been outlined on these slides are very important. And when you do look at the outcomes, it's around optimizing patient safety, very important to the hospital administrator, improving clinical outcomes, important to the clinicians, improving costs, administrators as well as clinicians think that is important. But at the end of the day, from a microbiological perspective, is how do we reduce ecological harm in terms of resistance, as well as other antimicrobial resistance toxicity. But what other definitions perhaps do not have enough of is also we need to talk about how we reduce unintended consequences. And a sign of a mature antimicrobial stewardship program is one that actually measures unintended consequences. And at the end of my talk, I'll give you a very practical example of work that we have done within the United Kingdom. Does stewardship work? I think this wonderful Cochrane review, which has been updated fairly recently, shows that despite giving less antibiotics, there is no increase in mortality with attendant benefits such as reduction in length of stay. That is a very important message to clinicians that doing stewardship will not actually cause their patients harm. And I think that's a very important message. And in this very succinct editorial commenting on the Cochrane review, I think it's a really important message that enabling interventions as well as restrictive interventions are associated with about a 15% increase in compliance with desired practice, be it, for example, compliance with following guidelines, de-escalation, taking cultures, all the kind of interventions that we think about. 15% may not seem dramatic, but that's what we seem to be able to achieve. What do we get in terms of, for that 15%? We get about a 2-day reduction in the duration of antibiotic treatment. So we're getting less use of antibiotics, and we get around a slightly greater than 1 day decrease in inpatient length of stay, but at all times and importantly, without compromising patient outcomes and patient safety. A systematic review from Asia gives us a second important message. And I like this review from Seto and colleagues, because not does it only show that antimicrobial stewardship programs work, but the message they also show that antimicrobial stewardship programs are much more effective if you combine them with high quality, well-implemented infection prevention and control practices. So I think the two need to be done hand in hand. And I also made the point about the importance recently of diagnostic stewardship. And this other review looked at the challenges in Asia, which is your part of the world. And they'll be familiar to all of you in terms of doing stewardship in an acute care setting. Epidemiology and surveillance systems need to be robust and consistent and uniform across the organizations. There is still lack of awareness, and in the present climate of the pandemic of COVID, there are some major concerns that COVID and the desire to overprescribe antimicrobials will be a potential driver for AMR, which is a silent epidemic which potentially will cause us even greater harm. Weak infrastructure, insufficient staff, education and training, funding remains a constant issue, as well as prescribers do not like being controlled when it comes to using antimicrobials and can be often resistant to AMS. And I think the clear message around infection control, or the lack of it, remains an important barrier to effective and high quality stewardship. The WHO has produced a very eloquent toolkit to help acute healthcare systems to be able to do antimicrobial stewardship. Whilst the focus is on lower and middle income countries, there is no doubt in my mind this toolkit is applicable to all settings, and I was one of the key authors of that. And it really identifies the key components of an antimicrobial stewardship program at a national level in terms of identifying the national core elements, then the healthcare elements, planning, performing, assessing, and facilitating. And that will be the focus of many of my talk. The toolkit talks about the types of interventions, the persuasive, more educational based ones, and the persuasive with more feedback. And really the point about the importance of audit and feedback as one of the key antimicrobial stewardship interventions will be made much later. Restrictive interventions are valuable, for example, pre-authorization, compliance with guidelines, formulary restrictions, but I believe that they have effect to, for example, control excessive use or an epidemic in a particular setting for a short amount of time. In terms of sustainable interventions, I think a combined approach with a focus on audit, feedback, and engagement and education is perhaps a more sustainable approach. And you need to have the structures in place, the committees, the people who are well trained, the laboratory, which is very engaged, for example, with the clinical community, are all important structural components of a stewardship program. And this slide will be familiar to the audience that I'm talking to, I suspect. But in the UK, we've tried to make the core components of stewardship intuitive and aligned to clinical decision-making. So we're talking about when you make the decision to prescribe an antibiotic, those are the front-end stewardship interventions. And then once you've prescribed, you are going to review the patient on a regular basis, and these are the back end. And this is where the feedback, audit, and education. Do you stop? Do you de-escalate? Do you change? Do you move the antimicrobial to a different setting? And so on are all back-end components of antimicrobial stewardship programs. And we're very focused on making sure that the clinicians document what they do. And if you're lucky enough to have electronic prescribing, then that is an important means of following the decision-making process as well as the management process in terms of managing the infection. Which stewardship programs work long-term, I've already alluded to. And this is an excellent study from TAMA showing that if you want to bring about a reduction in the amount, the days of therapy, or the DDDs, post-prescription audit and feedback is the way. But if you want to enhance immediate compliance with the guideline, for example, if you have an epidemic of a multi-drug resistant pathogen in the intensive care unit and formulary pre-authorization or restriction is required, you will bring about an improvement on compliance. But to me, I always feel that education, support, feedback is the more enabling, persuading long-term strategy that will bring you about a greater investment on your return. And I believe there's a number of data showing that it is a more cost-effective approach in the medium to long term. And the reason I put that up, this next slide of a review of stewardship programs in 116 tertiary hospitals in China, it is the most widely used antimicrobial stewardship intervention in Chinese hospitals. And when it comes to measuring outcomes, DDDs and DOTs, again, are very commonly used. And this is something for later. So I think it's important to understand what people are doing in terms of what strategies they're finding as effective in their own healthcare settings. So my second objective is now to go on to national AMS programs. And national AMS programs are beginning to be evaluated in terms of impact in a systematic and scientific manner. And this very recent publication in JAC from 2020 shows that national interventions to to improve antimicrobial use can be effective. A lot of the data is coming from higher or middle income countries, not enough from the lower income countries. And I think this is a theme that really is fairly consistent. But what they do show you is that they are effective. But the problem is that when you're comparing national programs with different countries, the outcome measures are not consistent and uniform to enable effective scientific comparisons. And I think we all agree that what we measure in terms of the effectiveness of the programs needs to be consistent and uniform. And again, this is something perhaps we can talk about in our discussions following the symposia. The core elements of a national program are well made and are very eloquently articulated in the toolkit. You need to have a strategy in which you make AMS a priority. You need funding, and you need the terms of agreement and the governance of the stewardship program at a national level, which will then encourage and facilitate local healthcare facility programs. You need to think about a medicines list that you're promoting, and I believe that the AWARE classification is something that is very useful to be able to use in your hospital, and we increasingly have adopted that, certainly in ours. Clinical guidelines, which then need to be enforced and regulated, are important, and prescription-only sales of antibiotics should be banned, and that is an immense challenge in the community setting. We need to think about how we raise the awareness amongst the public, the prescribers, as well as the healthcare professionals. And training programs, as I'll talk about in the second part of my presentation after this one, is at a pre-service level. We need to engage it at schools, at universities, at colleges, as well as in-service training for people who are delivering healthcare provision. We also then need to support these programs with surveillance, which again has to be consistent in terms of methodology. And I believe that point prevalence surveys in terms of antimicrobial quality are really pivotal to good stewardship, as well as microbiological surveillance at a national level, regional level, or at a local level. And the many components of how you enable a national program are outlined in this slide. For purposes of the time that I have, I can't go through all of it, but many of these components will be explained during this presentation. But before I talk about hospital healthcare facility-based stewardship programs, I wish to point out one important message that I want to bring from the slide that I put here in front of you. I think it's a really eloquent paper by Oliver Dyer and group. And what they talk about is the importance of an integrated approach to stewardship. And you need to think about how a particular healthcare facility as a hospital really relates to the community that it serves. And this one system approach, as well as the one health approach, which is a broader approach, has to be really the way we need to think about how we deliver stewardship. Because the patients of the community of yesterday are the patients in the hospital in the future or today. And unless the two are merged and the approaches are merged of how people prescribe in the community as well as in the hospital setting, ultimately the AMR and your stewardship response will not be as effective. You need to ground stewardship programs, certainly from what we learned in the first national stewardship program in Sweden, was that it needs to be grounded in daily practice. There needs to be some regional level of autonomy for them to then engage and do what they need to do. It needs to be multidisciplinary. And as I talked about very recently, it needs to be data driven, and that data is shared, and we learn from the data and we continue to improve. And in his presentation, the second important point is that whilst the antimicrobial stewardship program needs to be led by the clinicians, the doctors, the prescribers, the pharmacists, as well as the nurses, which I again will talk about shortly, I think at the heart of it, the hospital administrators and managers are very important, because unless you ensure that it is on their radar, it is on their agenda, they will not be able to support the implementation of your stewardship program. So the role of the hospital managers, as well as the IT, the patient safety program, the quality improvement program, all of them need to be aligned and coalesced to the vision that you have for your antimicrobial stewardship program. And my second point remains around the One Health Economy approach. And I was very pleased to see this very eloquent study by colleagues, including Alison Holmes from the Imperial. And it talks about this integrated approach of stewardship. And that integration is at a governance level, planning level, financing level, delivery level, which all of us are familiar with, monitoring level, as well as demand generation. And it's sad to see that only a handful of countries have taken this integrated approach. And the levels of integrations at the core components are very variable. In the United Kingdom, certainly, we have taken this integrated approach, but I was very pleased to see that our approach in Scotland, which is a population of 5.5 million people, was perhaps the first outside Sweden truly integrated antimicrobial stewardship program that incorporated all the core components that I've been talking about. Very multidisciplinary. There was non-medical leadership as well as medical leadership. The infection prevention community were brought in, as well as the surveillance. But at the heart of it, we included quality improvement and implementation science experts to help us in our journey of implementing the stewardship program, as well as we included pharmaceutical industry as part of the group. And we had a broad audience of policymakers, physicians, as well as people from the public. And I'll be sharing some of these experiences with you very shortly. So let me go on to the UK and Scottish experience. When the initial action plan was launched in 2013 to 2018, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, as devolved administrations, produced their own local action plan. Ours was called ScotMERAP, but reasonably aligned. But we did take a slightly different approach, and we started the national program at least 2 years before the English program came into place. And we were very much focused around taking an implementation science approach to building the program over the next decade. And these are just three pictures of the three programs from outside England. In the more recent UK program, which is again another 5-year action plan, we recognize the importance of being international and a collaborator as a global partner. We have improvised and integrated the importance of innovation, particularly around education, which I'll talk about next. We emphasize infection control and prevention. We recognize and ensure that the animal health and the agriculture One Health approach is important. We talk about environmental spread, and we talk about the supply and access issues that many countries across the world have. We talk about engagement of public, as well as the importance of demonstrating appropriate use, which is the stewardship bit, which I'll focus on now. So Scotland, as you will be aware, is part of the United Kingdom, and we set up a program in 2008. No other country apart from Sweden had a dedicated national stewardship program, which I was fortunate enough to be led, and I was appointed by the government to take part and run this program. At the heart of it, we created a team, which is very implementation focused. We created a vision of what we wanted, and we had a huge outbreak of Clostridium difficile in our care homes, which was one of the major drivers, as well as multi-drug resistant E. coli at that time in some of our healthcare facility, as well as long-term care facility settings. So we had an impetus, a focus of where we wanted to achieve our improvement. So there was a readiness to commit. So once the vision was shared, the organizations around the hospitals, the general practitioners, the community, and the social care teams all became an important bunch of structures that we needed to enhance. But obviously there was a significant focus on the hospitals, which for this audience, I will focus on. This is the current national website. It has changed from the time over 10 to 12 years that I led it. We are split into boards, and the boards deliver primary care as well as secondary care. So we have an integrated healthcare system, but the secondary healthcare system obviously worked very closely as possible with the general practitioners. But at the heart of what we're trying to achieve, we made sure that we followed the basic quality improvement science principles of Donabedian, that if you ensure that the structures and the cultures that the structures function with are optimal, and then the processes are well implemented and effectively implemented, you will achieve a range of outcomes which you set out as your goals. And to me, this is really very fundamental. It may seem a very simplistic, but I think a very intuitive and very simple approach to how we achieved the successes as well as some failures in relation to our antimicrobial stewardship program. So this is what I'm going to talk about next. I like this equation which we've created. in which structures and processes which are well implemented will achieve the outcomes. And it becomes a theme as we move through this presentation. I refer you to this excellent paper from Mark Mendelsohn and colleagues just at the end of 2019. For those of you who are at different parts of the journey in starting a stewardship program, many of you may be at the beginning, some of you at the middle, some of you fairly advanced. But what is very badly done when I go around the world, and I've advised a very large number of clinical communities and governments across the globe in their stewardship programs, is the planning phase is inadequately done. And planning, 80% of the time you spend on stewardship programs, particularly in the first few months, is planning the stewardship program. You need to prepare, you need to understand the culture, you need to understand the resources, a SWOT analysis, what are the barriers and the facilitators of stewardship in your part of the world, who are going to be the champions and the early adopters. Is there any expertise that you don't have that you need to bring in? And once you do the planning process, you begin to then gradually start the implementation process, which I think is important. In terms of planning, the WHO toolkit talk about the importance of doing a local SWOT analysis. You understand what's in place, the structures, the policies, the resources, what data you have. Can you collect this data? How is the data collected? What are the kind of measures you want to think about implementing and then monitoring? Who's going to be accountable? What do you prioritize? Who's going to be responsible? And are there any other structures that you need to bring on board? And do they comply with the core elements that are required to deliver your stewardship program? And when you need to understand what are the barriers and the facilitators, what are the environmental resources and what's the context? Are there adequate laboratory facilities? What are your goals? Are there other goals for the organization leadership that may hinder your stewardship program? What are the social influences? What are the people in the community, the doctors who don't want a stewardship program, and how are you going to deal with them? What are the behavior regulatory components that might help or facilitate your program? What are the knowledge deficits and what are the knowledge requirements? Very fundamental to determining the type of educational program that you will put into place. What are the beliefs and consequences of your system? How do the different professions, the nurses, the doctors, the pharmacists, are the pharmacists a really key part of the hospital fabric, as well as the governance, as well as the stewardship program? What are the intentions of the people that you're going to try to influence? How are you going to reinforce? Are there financial or other incentives that you might need to put into place, as well the levels of skills and training that I've mentioned? So this study is excellent in terms of trying to get you to understand where you might need to be. In terms of structures, this is an example in 2008 that we set up. We have the higher level accountability and responsibility. So the chief executive and our medical director became performance managers of the stewardship and infection control program. That was a game changer for me. I tried for many years before that, but unless it was part of their performance metric, it will not get the same level of attention. Then we had an infection control committee as well as a stewardship committee that talked very closely together and very much aligned to risk management and patient safety also. It was multidisciplinary, all the surgeons, the oncologists, and I encourage you not only to bring on board the clinicians that want to support you, but also include once or twice clinicians who are not that bought into the stewardship program, because it's them that you will need to influence. And by having them as part of the structures is one way of encouraging them to understand your agenda. And the role of nurses is particularly important, and I'll talk about that later. Because whilst we understand the role of pharmacists, clinical pharmacists, stewardship pharmacists, as well as doctors, the nurses provide daily care, and the roles outside in terms of admitting the patient, monitoring the patient, making sure that they're not experiencing any side effects, as well as the clinical progress, the nurses have a very important role. And I believe that they should be a fundamental part of stewardship programs. They're a fundamental part of infection control programs. So I think that there is shared wisdom and experience, and bringing that together is an economies of scale that you will benefit from. In the UK, we are the first country, and I was the first person in Scotland to appoint a nurse practitioner specialist in antimicrobial stewardship to be part of the team. And if any of you are interested in the role of nurses, we've set up a forum through the British Society for Antimicrobial Chemotherapy that any of you can join to share resources and have a broad learning experience around the role of nurses, as well as other professions also. the role of culture is critical to an antimicrobial stewardship program, because you can have great strategy, you can have great technical resources, the range of interventions that I've talked about, and you have high quality structures. But if your culture is poor, then your stewardship program will be short lasting and doomed for failure. And what does this culture mean? And I suspect it will be familiar to many of you. And this is a slide of Dr. House and many of the colleagues that he works with. And you need to recognize the different departments and different clinicians in your organization. Who are the good prescribers and who are the prescribers that use ceftazidime, clindamycin, gentamicin, caspofungin? And they'll be familiar to many of you. Those are often the hematology, oncology, or the intensivists. So by understanding the prescribing culture of the departments of the clinicians, you'll be able to understand the tact that you take in terms of try to influence them when you're beginning to implement your antimicrobial stewardship program. And these prescribing etiquettes are familiar to each and every hospital. It's in the fabric of the culture of the hospital. There is a hierarchy. There is, in some poor hospitals, which will fail because of the culture, there's an acceptance of non-compliance. People will also justify giving broad-spectrum antibiotics because I'm very senior, my patients are very sick, my patients are special, I'm allowed to do that, and the leadership will allow to do that. So those are all real challenges that you will need to think about if you're going to be able to effect real long-term sustainable change. And this very wonderful paper looking at 24 hospitals from 5 countries with different cultures looked at what really supported and disabled stewardship. So restriction of professional boundaries. I am the doctor, I am the neurosurgeon, nobody can tell me what I need to do. That kind of approach is a major issue in the success of a stewardship program. Healthcare workers may not be engaged in your vision and your agenda and what you like to do. And that again came as a very important barrier to stewardship. In lower and middle income countries, everybody thought that you should just take the same approach. And I really urge you that the approach that you take needs to be Hong Kong specific and not Scotland specific. You need to learn from good experiences, but you need to contextualize what you do to the setting that you're delivering that stewardship interventions into. And interestingly, across the 5 countries, our colleagues in surgery were found to be the most difficult to engage with for a range of culture and other reasons. But it's important to understand and ultimately something to address. The importance of clinical leadership is not a world opinion leader who flies around the world and talks about stewardship. Often is not the important person who will deliver your stewardship program. It's that clinical champion who has the respect and the integrity to support you in delivering what you need. And that clinical leadership at a departmental level is very key to ensuring success. And it does not necessarily always have to be a doctor. It can be a nurse, it can be a pharmacist. It just depends on how that department is glued together and what the leadership looks like. I'd like to now move on to the AMS interventions. And I think that once you've moved past the planning and then you're getting into the early implementation phase, usually around the 3 to 6 month mark, you need to identify what are you going to do, where, and how. And you need to think about where are the problem areas and where do you prioritize. And that identifying that low-hanging fruit, what you can do with the least amount of resource that you have the highest amount or likelihood of success is that low-hanging fruit. And data is very important. And making that assessment is in that planning process, so then you can go ahead and start to implement. And at all times, this will depend on what resources you have, what is the readiness of that organization, that department, that ward. I've talked about culture, and then where do you prioritize? I believe that point prevalence surveys, either at a hospital level, ward level, regional level, departmental level, doesn't really matter, are very important in understanding the quality of prescribing. You need to be able to measure, and DDDs or DOTs are often used, and both have their strengths and their weaknesses. You can do simple audit with or without feedback, but you use an array of review methods to give you the data and the intelligence that you require to give you what you need to do next. And in Scotland, we did a national survey based on ESAC serology and ESAC methodology in 2008, 2009. Every acute hospital had a point prevalence survey, and we found what we expected, that there was a lot of non-compliance with guidelines. Surgical prophylaxis stood out as a very important area where stewardship was required, because more than a third were getting antibiotics for more than a day, and only 45% were getting a single dose of an antibiotic. We began to also realize that recording on the notes, compliance with guidelines, depending on where you were, the route of administration was often IV, and we began to then, at a granular level, drill down to which specialties had the poor prescribing in relation to surgical prophylaxis. So it gives you incredibly valuable information to where you want to intervene. And when you look at the low-hanging fruit, this is a very nice paper from Deborah, which will be familiar to all of you, from Deborah Groff from the United States. But it's, adherence to guidelines, de-escalation, changing from IV to oral, keeping the duration of antibiotics short, and the taking of simple cultures are all things that are very achievable, and you get a high level of return for low levels of investment. And when we begin to collect that data, we began to find that the ICU was a potential focus, but we found, for example, in the medicine for the elderly, huge areas of antimicrobial use. We began to identify where the problems of high AMR were from surveillance. The point prevalence survey told us where the poor compliance with guidelines were. So it began to give us a picture and a landscape of what the prescribing activity was, quality as well as quantity. And on top of that, once we began to understand the cultures of where this activity was beginning to undertake, we began to formulate in our head of a kind of stewardship program that we wanted to put into place in our different healthcare settings. And we, at many times, as our toolkit talks about, we undertook a very simplistic quality improvement approach, familiar to all of you, particularly those of you who have worked in infection control for many years, of preparing, planning, doing, and studying. But the final bit we've added is the adjusting, because by learning from that, you adjust and then you re-implement by preparing and planning again. So that is the kind of cycle that we used. And we actually did this many, many years ago before we even published this in the WHO toolkit. How we articulate our ambitions, what we want to do by when, and who's going to do it. What are going to be the key drivers that will allow us to achieve these main goals and targets, and what are the interventions? And in improvement science, it's articulated through what we call a driver diagram. And this driver diagram approach is clear, intuitive, and allows you to encompass all the key players and the actors that you wish, and what are you going to measure as part of that. And at the time of starting our stewardship program, we launched a driver diagram for the Scottish program in terms of what our aims were, what were the key drivers, and what were the secondary drivers outlined in this very detailed slide. And I put it to you just as an example of many ways of setting out your action plan for your healthcare facility level antimicrobial stewardship program. We then began to make them, articulate them in a more simplistic, clinically friendly way. So we did that for acute care, and we did that, for example, for antimicrobial stewardship, for the surgical prophylaxis. What were the clean programs, the clean contaminated and the contaminated, what we wanted to do, when do you redose, and what is the kind of documentation that is required. This really made it very clear in an A4 sheet of paper or electronically available of what we wanted to achieve and what we wanted the healthcare professional team to do. And also, we really used translating evidence into practice, implementation science. So we summarized the evidence that the clinicians who are busy would understand. We identified the local barriers because we really walked the process to understand that. We measured where we could, where the problems were and where the successes were. And then once we have really identified which interventions we wanted to put into place, we began to engage, educate, execute, and evaluate. And again, a very familiar approach used in other settings, which we applied to antimicrobial stewardship. What I'd like to move on to now is measurement. And measurement is very important. The first question you need to ask is not only what do you want to measure, is why do you want to measure? Why do you want to measure? And majority of us who come from scientific backgrounds we understand the importance of research and measurement, but we want to primarily measure for improvement. And some of these measures for improvement then turned into measures for accountability and performance. And this is an eloquent paper that talks about the different approaches to measurement. And I, for many years, had done lots and lots of audits. So you measure over 8 months, 6 months, and then you analyze and bring all that data together. By the time your 1-year audit project is finished, people have moved on, all sorts of poor practice has continued, and the ability to make change in real time has gone. So the much more improvement science approach of collecting small amounts of data on a regular basis that is shared and then actionable is perhaps a much more important way of effecting good stewardship and change. In the toolkit, we talk about structure measures, process measures, and outcome measures, and all of those, again, will be familiar to you. But we need to measure them at the baseline, and then we begin to measure them as we move forward at a hospital, department, or a ward level. And I'll give you many examples of that. This slide showed you the type of structural measures, process measures, and outcome measures, as well as balancing measures, which are measuring for unintended consequence, which I'll talk about right at the end. But the alignment that you need to believe is that doing process effectively and to a high level of compliance will achieve in the long term better outcomes. So that has been our focus. We ensured good structures, but we ensured high level of compliance with processes that ultimately we began to show an impact on outcomes, which again, I will share. And these outcomes can be clinical, from mortality, length of stay, and so on, to ecological and microbiological, to simple levels of consumption, as well as financial in terms of cost or cost effectiveness. Structural indicators are very important. So we made sure, as this slide shows, that across our 14 health boards, there was good teamwork, there was a committee, there was regular ward rounds, there was audit, there was guidelines, and so on. So you could do that easily across hospitals all across Hong Kong, for example. And structural indicators are a very good way of starting your stewardship measurement. And then you measure amount, and we mainly used data around DDDs and days of therapy. But this slide really shows you that cost data is important, but as a means of accurate reflection of antimicrobial utilization, perhaps not the most optimal. So you have to make a balanced decision about the type of metrics that you're going to use in terms of measuring consumption of antibiotics. When we created quality measures as part of our point prevalence survey, we actually were the first country to move from regular point prevalence surveys to then developing some targets, which became eventually measures of performance of the antimicrobial stewardship program. And that is something that we've been very slow to do, but we did that over a 12-year period, and something potentially what you may wish to sort of think about. We took surgical prophylaxis as one of our low-hanging fruit and as our priorities. We identified what we wanted to do, what are the types of intervention, where, and for how long. But we're very clear of what we wanted to measure as metrics. Time to antibiotic, the choice of antibiotic, was it compliant with guideline, whether it was a narrow spectrum use, and we wanted to cut duration of antibiotic past 24 hours, all very much consistent with the current evidence base. It was recorded initially on a piece of paper, ultimately then electronically. And I urge you that always try things on paper first. It will allow you to iron out any problems. And if it begins to work in a paper form, it will then begin to work on an electronic form. And we made it very simple to measure. We collected small amounts of data on a regular basis. So if you had 50 admissions to your acute admissions unit, we would take 15 to 20 samples each week, randomly allocated to measure compliance with guidelines and so on. So you would identify what you want to measure and how often you want to measure and how much you want to measure, depending on the kind of activity that you're trying to measure. And Jacqueline Sneddon, I suspect, was the pharmacist from SAPG, will perhaps talk about this in a bit more detail, and I've used a couple of her slides. The data that you get is quite astonishing. We put this on a run chart, and we begin to look at our different interventions and compliance with that, and we set a 95% level of compliance. You don't need to set that to begin with. This is a quality improvement science, suggests that that would be a way to achieve. You may want to start at 70% and then gradually move the bar of your level of compliance, but you need to get it to 95 to ensure that your implementation of the processes are ideal, so that then you can go and achieve the outcomes in question. And you notice from this slide, we measured outcomes that were related to the front end component of a stewardship program, for example, compliance with guidelines and the writing of the indication in the notes, and also toward the back end of the stewardship program, such as are they changing from IV to oral, or are they documenting the duration of IV? Are they, for example, then de-escalating depending on availability of culture and so on? So these are many kind of things that you can potentially do. The point prevalence approach has been applied at a global level. It can be used for benchmarking across Hong Kong hospitals, as long as the measures are aligned and consistent and uniform. And we publish this in Lancet Global Health, the point prevalence survey. We now collect data through an app. So on the app, not only do we have formularies and all the kind of things that a junior doctor or doctor needs to prescribe, but we can actually undertake an audit if you happen to be doing a ward or a department at a particular time. And that data is fed centrally to be able to provide information for all concerned. And technology can be very useful in terms of not only undertaking and helping with the clinical decision-making process, but actually with the audit or point prevalence process is also important. In terms of targets for secondary care, I think it's important that we move from, we have quality measures for improvement. We think about, can we use any of them as targets? And like many of us, we had excessive use of piperacillin and tazobactam, as well as carbapenems. So we began to then make compliance and reducing those particular agents, as well as the total amount of antibiotics, as national targets that each of the health boards across our population had to achieve. And we began to give clinicians alternatives to using piperacillin and tazobactam, for example, aztreonam and gentamicin for the treatment of gram-negative infections. So we began to use, are they using more alternatives and less piperacillin and carbapenems? And we published this data over a 3 to 5 year period. And we undertook a national collaborative quality improvement program primarily to optimize carbapenems. And as you see, we used 3 phases to our program. And after the interventions, there was initially a stabilization followed by a reduction in our antimicrobial, in our use of carbapenems. So what about data? We put all these processes into place. What did we achieve? Well, at a primary care level, we showed a dramatic reduction in the overuse of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Those were the quinolones, clindamycin, coamoxiclav, and the cephalosporins. And we showed not only across the population, but particularly in our vulnerable population of the elderly and those working in care homes. So that point I made about the integrated approach is very important. But what did we do in hospitals, which I suspect will be of interest to this audience? Well, data from our own region showed a dramatic reduction in these 4 CUs of antibiotics. These high-risk antibiotics led to a dramatic reduction in Clostridium difficile, not only in our primary care setting, but also in our medical and surgical setting through an interrupted time series analysis. So beginning to see at a regional level, huge impact of reduction in broad-spectrum antibiotics on this occasion as the C. diff as the primary clinical outcome. We then showed it across Scotland in this study in Lancet Infectious Diseases that over a 5 to 8 year period, combined with good infection control, a national stewardship program led to a significant reduction in Clostridium difficile. But to me, and this is 12 years of my life's work, that what I've been most proud of is this study, is that over a 10-year period of a stewardship program in the community as well as the hospital, we showed, and very, very few papers across the world have shown this, is that we showed a reduction, initially a stabilization, and a reduction in drug resistance amongst gram-negative bacteremia being admitted into the hospital. And there was around a 3.5 to 4 year lag before that happens. And it's important to understand that when we look at the impact on resistance, there's a significant lag depending on the type of antibiotics that you're using on what you will achieve when it comes to impact on resistance. How you communicate that data with different clinicians is important. You know, whether you emphasize cost, whether you emphasize use, you emphasize mortality, and depending on who you're having the conversation with, and the type of data that you're emphasizing is important. And you need to be a really good, effective data communicator to make sure that all this hard work that you've achieved does not go to waste. How you share data, I'll give you an example of Public Health England using fingertips, so you can really begin to see performance at a granular level, from practice to a surgery to a hospital, in terms of the different indicators they've set out in England. So I think that kind of data that is shared and in the public domain is quite important. But when you take finally a One Health approach, in the United Kingdom, different countries have done something differently, but they have taken increasing a One Health approach. We're beginning to see some interesting results. We have seen a 35% reduction in prescribing in animals, around a 6% reduction in people, in around a 19% reduction overall over a 4 to 5 period of the action plan. And as you will see from the top or the bottom slide, there's beginning to see some early impact on the indicators of gram-negative bacteremia, as well as MRSA. So we're beginning to see, in terms of all the domains of the metrics, some impact of a national stewardship program on the different indicators. What are perhaps some final thoughts and challenges before I finish this symposium? And I did at the onset talk about the importance of balancing measures, because to every intervention, there may be a potential undesirable intervention that you anticipated, or perhaps you did not anticipate, an unpleasant surprise. This is the law of unintended consequences. And sometimes we do not mean to do harm, but harm occurs. Or if you are potentially going to do harm, then you need to be able to proactively measure that. And I'll give you one example to illustrate that. In England, not in Scotland, there has been financial incentives to comply with targets to enhance performance, particularly performance relating to giving antibiotics to sepsis patients within 1 hour. At the same time, the AMR, AMS bit of it was to reduce consumption of carbapenems and piperacillin and to ensure review of the antibiotics at 24 to 48 hours. So I think you're getting an incentive to comply with sepsis compliance as well as stewardship compliance. And ultimately, the hope was that that would lead to enhanced outcomes from the stewardship. And there were a range of financial interventions and incentives that were put into place. And we all understand that the emerging data from across the globe is that there is a concern that overuse of antibiotics is being driven by the sepsis program, because really where you need to intervene to get the most benefit is in severe sepsis. Because if you simply intervene in a timely fashion with sepsis, the data suggests that the impact on mortality perhaps is not as significant as one would expect when you've got a more severely unwell patient with septic shock in the studies that I have shown. And a paper from JAMA that took into stock all of this information really was talking about that clinicians need to not approach this treat first, ask questions later, because what that may be doing is driving excessive use of antibiotics because of the diagnostic uncertainty. And we need to just think about what is the optimal situation where early use of antibiotics is recommended in patients with diagnosed sepsis. And very recently, just at the end of last year in England, Mervyn Singer and colleagues really made a very important point that sepsis is being overdiagnosed because the drive of sepsis and the financial benefits associated with that. And at the same time, sepsis is being overcoded, and many of the patients that were coded as sepsis, because you get more money when you do that, perhaps did not have sepsis. So all of these potentially could be the unintended consequences of targets being set for an antimicrobial stewardship program. Finally, many of you will come to a stage in which you have done all the things that we've been talking about, and you're not making the impact or sustaining the impact. And I think sustaining stewardship program is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for us. And this is where I think some of the behavior, cultural interventions are going to be most effective. And this 7-year study of a stewardship program in a large academic center from the United States eloquently highlights the importance of sustainability. We all think that after a few years, we begin to achieve many of the good outcomes, that we take the foot off the pedal. And as soon as you do that, things will return to poor practice. So you need to change the habit of how prescribers, and you need to change the prescribing culture so it becomes normal as opposed to abnormal. And ensuring that is the way to sustainability, but not always difficult, not always easy to do. And you need to bring about all the important components of implementation science, from innovation to leadership, to knowledge into action, to human factors, to engagement, to culture, to evaluation, to empowerment and change management. All of these are important to bring about resilience and to bring about sustainability. Finally, this paper from 2016 talked about some of the key components that lead to successful programs: leadership, engagement, monitoring, evaluation, knowledge creation, translation, and mobilization, and how you bring about sustainability. I think this is an even better way of thinking about the importance not only of structure, resources, and data, but how you integrate them into how we communicate, how we trust, bring about relationships, and how we manage challenges and conflicts. Only when you do these things in an integrated and successful way will you bring about long-term change. Finally, a paper for you, recently published, takes a implementation science approach to antimicrobial stewardship, and I would commend that to many of you. And finally, I'd like to finish to thank many of my colleagues. I've now just retired from clinical practice. On my left are my clinical colleagues. I'm leaving all this work to a wonderful bunch of young colleagues, but also with many colleagues that I've worked with antimicrobial stewardship at a national level. And Jackie Snedden is one of the speakers in your program. Andrew Seaton, who's now the current chair, as well as many, many other colleagues. Thank you very much for your attention, and I sincerely look forward to our discussions and your questions. Thank you again.